So we are live now. Perfect. Hello and welcome everybody to our next round in the cybersecurity talks from our key factor. And today we will talk a little bit more in general about why certificates are needed in the IoT environment and where they are needed in the IoT environment, especially here in Europe when we see or when we saw last week the NES directive number 2 was released by the European Commission, and now it's time for all of our member states to implement this directive into their national laws. And I think we all know that PKI will play a very significant role, especially when we see into existing standards. And that brings us to the point where my colleagues from North America, Alan Boehm, yeah, who is heading the IoT department in Key Factor, and my colleague Guillaume um, will talk a little bit more in detail about why certificates are needed and why they are used in the IoT space. So I directly hand it over to Alan and Guillaume to start and to dive deeper into the presentation. Please.
Thank you, Andreas. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. Looking forward to the discussion today. So we have a few slides, so I'm going to go ahead and share for some background for the discussion today. So our main topic, again, is why do we think digital identities are essential for IoT? And when I think about all of the connected devices that either have already been invented or have maybe not even been imagined, each one of these devices is something that is connecting to the internet, that is sending data around what's the operation of that equipment, whether it is a very complex turbine or a transportation vehicle, an airplane, or something as maybe tiny but very, very highly valuable as an embedded medical device. Each one of these machines is something that needs to be uniquely addressed only by authorized parties. And the way that we do that is by ensuring that every one of those things has a unique identity. And then subsequently, every identity has a way to be managed. So just as, people, we have identities, we have passports, we have identification cards to be able to validate us, and those are issued by authorized standards bodies, right? Or our local government, for example. That needs to be updated and that needs to be refreshed. And so it's the whole concept of having a unique identity and then being able to manage that identity to prove the validity of it over time. So some of the challenges that we see in IoT device design and manufacturing can be shown here. So firstly, when we get the opportunity to work with designers, firmware developers, architects of these connected devices, there's always constraints or boundaries that we must work within. There's generally some type of operating system. There is oftentimes already a PCB design or a module or a chipset that must be used, right? And so we have to work within that to figure out how can this device leverage a certificate? How can that be embedded into the firmware? How can we do the proper signing, code signing around that code to protect it? So there's initial design and development that we need to go through. Secondly is manufacturing. So once a design is produced, many OEMs leverage multiple manufacturing partners globally. We're very much a global economy. So having that flexibility to be able to produce parts in multiple factories, whether or not they may be owned by you, oftentimes it's trusting someone to produce your design and to produce it securely. Also, to put in that secure identity to make sure that not a counterfeit identity is placed in there. Moving more towards the steady state, we get into operational challenges. So how you actually take these devices that were produced, commission them into the environments in which they will live, whether that's a hospital or a factory, or if it's a vehicle on the road. And then how do we maintain the authenticity of that device over time if you need to update the credential, which is recommended. Think about long-lived assets that could be 15 or 20 years in their useful life. We want to make sure that we have the capability to update that credential that was built into it when it was born, such that you can keep up with changing times of cryptography, with quantum computing advances and things like that. And then finally, there's the sort of, what do you do when it's end of life and you want to decommission? Can you revoke that credential so that no one can address that device or modify that device? So these are some of the things that we've seen kind of setting the stage for why we think digital identities is so important in the IoT space. So moving on, I'm going to hand it over to Guillaume to kind of talk us through a little bit about additional challenges.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Good morning, everybody. So I will start by focusing on exactly the two categories that you've highlighted in previous slide, which is what's happening during the design of the product and the manufacturing of the product. So here we're addressing to OEMs, so those manufacturers of connected devices. And here the importance of a digital identity can be highlighted in different categories. So I think the very first category, which is important, is by tagging your device with your brand, just like you imprint a logo on the product that you manufacture. Okay, so every company manufacturing something has a trademark, has a brand name, has a logo, which is a visual on the product, which can be recognized instantly in the real world. And tagging that product with a digital certificate, which is a digital logo that proves the ownership, that proves the brand of the device when the device has been manufactured, is a very strong way of imprinting an identity into a device that can be further checked down the road by whomever will be operating the product or owning the product or transacting with the product. So it's a way to prove that the device is genuine and that the device does not suffer from counterfeiting at manufacturing, for instance, which means that if you're manufacturing something and you have to rely on overseas factory, and sometimes if your product is so good, which I think we can wish that to everyone, that it's being copied, and you don't want your competition to impersonate your own brand. And the way to do that is by securing a very strong digital way with cryptography and certificates your brand into your device, and that brand must be able to be checked whenever will be necessary. So speaking of manufacturing and outsourcing, it's also a very, very convenient way to make sure that when you manufacture overseas, you don't need to trust the factory which is manufacturing your products, which means that you want to be able to contract with a company and to tell them you manufacture 10,000 products for me and not 10,001. So you can keep an exact count of what's being manufactured and what's being issued in terms of digital identity to the exact number of products that are being manufactured. The mechanics behind the digital identity also play a very important role in product differentiation. So now imagine that you're manufacturing the same product, but you can give it different flavors. So you can customize your product depending on the markets you're selling to, or maybe the tiers you're selling to. You may have lower end products and middle and high end products. And they all rely on the same hardware because you want to cut costs in terms of product development and hardware. But you want to differentiate your products with software. And you don't want to manufacture to answer demands or commands. So you want to make sure that you can manufacture something generic, and then you can address the differentiator later in the product manufacturing by injecting the proper software. And you can do that by checking the identity of the product and assigning it to a tier. And when your product is being deployed, that allows then traceability, a much easier traceability, because then each product is easily, uniquely identifiable by your servers and your services, and which can go up to dealing with RMAs. So it's the way you return merchandise when you have a default or a customer which isn't happy and wants to be refunded, or something needs to be fixed. So first you need to assess whether the product was misused or not. And by having these strong digital identity inside the product, you're able to talk to the product and to check whether it's been misused or not. And of course, by establishing this digital identity into your product, you're setting the ground for many more services that will be able to be implemented in the product down the road. And that's the next slide.
Yeah, maybe Guillaume,
yes.
Let me jump in, because there's one question that is connecting to this slide very well. So the question is that somebody from the audience has the challenge to automate the certificate renewal process for a certain time, like in the normal world, as you, Alan, explained, that the people ID every 15 years we have to take a new photo and we apply for a new ID card. So in the end of the day, what you want to say, and that is my interpretation, is that we are missing this point, that we have not this renewal process in place. That brings me to one question to you. Should the renewal process for device identity, should it be built into the product or into the operating system of a product? So in the underlying basics, like we see a web server today is able to renew the DNS web certificate automatically while the website is running on top of the server.
That's interesting. So here, the certificates we're talking about in this very precise case, and again, I'm talking about common practice. So OEMs tend to embed lifelong certificates into their products, and this is exactly what we're talking about here. So what they usually do is that they put a certificate inside the device, which will stay for the life of the device. So that certificate we're talking about here will not be renewed very often, because it's not the operational certificate. That certificate is only here to be able to prove the genuineness of the device and to get access to more services and maybe to more certificates to do the real security of the connectivity, for instance, or the real security of the firmware update. So that certificate, that identity we're talking about here, is really tied to the product manufacturing. It's really an imprint of the device identity by the manufacturer itself. And sometimes it can be renewed, but very often it is not. And that's not the best practice, but as long as that cert is not being used often, that's really okay. And as long as it can resist, like I was mentioning the new post-quantum cryptography, or if we have means to upgrade the device for that, that's even better. But you have to bear in mind that many IoT devices are designed on existing hardware today, and that existing hardware has accelerators and limitations with regards to what cryptography can handle. So the advice is to use what's the state of the art today in terms of cryptography. And if you can, yes, be ready to implement mechanisms to allow the renewal of that cert. But that one, again, that cert here is not the operational cert.
Right. Gotcha. Perfect.
Okay, good question. Cool. Okay, so I think we're going to expand a little bit more on the OTA and lifecycle management. So I think that question was a great lead-in to a couple more points Guillaume's going to talk about.
Yes, exactly. And then that ties back to your first slide. And we're now in operation. So now the product is being deployed in the field by somebody who will provide services around it. So again, that company, and maybe a very different company from the manufacturer of the product, that company has a brand, and that company wants to imprint, again, like the OEM at manufacturing, that company wants to imprint its brand into the product. So again, it's a very good idea to own the identity of the device, and we'll elaborate on ways to do that later. What it allows, that digital identity, it allows to deploy devices by implementing, well, the holy grail called the zero trust, the zero touch provisioning. Basically, how can you deploy devices in the field without having to trust the installer, or how to deploy those devices without having to go through tedious manual processes? So how can you automate and secure at the same time? So how can you connect devices with customers? They may be individual customers in B2C, or they can be corporate customers in B2B. How can you deploy them in the field and commission them onto networks, commission them onto applications without touching them as much as you can? Again, those digital identities can play a very, very interesting role in business. And I'll discuss about that a little bit later. But imagine that you have an identity like this passport, which is only valid for a fixed period of time, okay? Not before, not after. And imagine that you are selling services that are prepaid to customers, and that customers contract with a not before, not after period of time. And using certificates to deploy your services, and using exactly that validity date, and tying that to the contract duration you're signing with your customer, is a very, very convenient way to make sure that your customers will have access to services for the exact duration of that contract, not before and not after, without implementing any further mechanisms. Another business consideration is, how can you make yourself independent from the partners you're using? So imagine you're using cellular connectivity, and depending on the countries where you're deploying your devices, you're contracting with an MNO, an operator, and you're contracting for maybe 2 years or 3 years. But then what happens? Do you want to make sure that you're not tied with that partner? Again, if you're using Azure or a cloud provider, how can you make sure that you are not tied for life with that partner? And again, that's by owning your own identities, and make sure that you are issuing those identities yourself and managing those identities yourself, that you can redeploy, and that you can redeploy your fleet of devices to different platforms or to different partners. A very important consideration when it comes to complying with security standards, and we're talking about what's coming up in Europe, like you said, Andreas, earlier, or in the US, is that it will be required that every company monitors the health of the product they're deploying in the field. And a way to do that without cryptography, I think, does not exist. So again, if you have a strong identity inside your device, you have a way to establish health reports from time to time from your embedded software, and to sign those health reports with a strong identity that you own and manage yourself, and that you can believe. And then you can, in real time, have a good monitoring of what's happening in the field and take measures, appropriate measures, so that your customers feel secure. And like you were saying, Hélène, I think that everybody wants to optimize maintenance costs when deploying devices. So in the steady state mode, you will need to perform firmware upgrades over the air of your devices, because of course firmware will be evolving. You will be adding features, you will be fixing bugs, maybe you'll be fixing security, maybe you'll be upgrading security itself. And sometimes you want to be able to suspend a service, to suspend a customer, to repurpose a device, maybe to manage a change of ownership of a device. You know, there are companies that rent equipment and the equipment goes from one customer to another. So how do you repurpose that equipment? How do you change the credential of the end user in a very secure way, and by always associating that to billing accounts? So again, a strong identity in a device and a strong operational identity, which is different from the first OEM identity, is very, very powerful to do so.
Thank you. So shifting on a little bit, we've mentioned the acronym PKI. So just want to talk a little bit about that in case there's someone who's not as familiar with public key infrastructure as we are. Again, as mentioned, we have customers that have built PKIs and designed PKIs for millions of identities in manufacturing for devices that are being produced once a second, or to very complex machines that maybe are only producing 1,000 machines a year. In each case, I think it's important to figure out the proper PKI design for the production environment that you're working with, as well as then perhaps the system in which this then device would then operate, depending on who is actually owning it and managing it in the end. So all of those pieces go into designing a PKI. So I wanted to have Guillaume explain a little bit more about some concepts around that, including also what really do we put into a certificate that would be an identity for IoT?
Okay. So I like to say that certificates are like passports. So they're here to prove the identity, the ownership of a physical asset, and basically that document can list a lot of different things. So some are very standard, of course, the owner of the product, the name of the product, the ID serial number, the identity of the issuer. Like I mentioned, the validity period. So it's not before, not after, and then you can and then it is signed by that issuer, and the signature is done cryptographically, which means that it can be checked. And that signature belongs to a tree. So then I'm shifting to the right of the screen here. And so if you have a device certificate at the bottom left here, that picture, you know that it has been signed, issued by the entity, the certificate which is just above it, which itself can belong to a more complex hierarchy of certificates and identities. Just, something that belongs to the company. The more important is that at the very top, what we call the root, CA for certificate authority, that root must be operated and must belong to the company that owns the whole tree and the whole family of products and services that are being secured by the leaves. And the way we organize the tree, as you said, it really depends on, it's really very personal choice for the company. So some companies will like to mimic into the design of the PKI tree the way they organize themselves. So into business units and family of products. Some others will segment the tree by key usage, like it is exemplified here. So we have to the left, we have product certificates, and to the right, where we have here the firmware software signature. And again, some will make a different choice and will segment the trees by the cryptographic families of the keys that they will be using. So some will segment RSA keys and ECC and key sizes. And of course, it can be a combination of everything. But very important is that tree, whatever the architecture, and there's no good answer to its design. Many solutions are possible, but I think what's very important is that the company owning the tree really operates the tree and does not delegate that route to any partner who would share that route with other customers or competitors. And the mechanics of the certificate itself is very, very powerful, because you can have many extensions into the certificate. You can put together lists of certificates that are valid or not valid any longer, and there are mechanisms to check those. So you can revoke certificates just like the way you can revoke a passport for a real person. And tying back to what you were saying of this, there are mechanisms to renew those certs in a very automated way or manual way, depending on what's the number of assets you have to look after. But most important is that there's a great toolbox already in this picture here to implement many business models and to automate a lot of security into product usage, product design, and product management.
So in this next bit, we want to explain a little bit more about some of the impacts that we see when it comes to business outcomes and how device identity and proper implementation of device identity can either hurt or help your business. So we mentioned this briefly, but really it's around protecting brand or corporate identity. And as a cybersecurity software company, we hear daily about companies in the news who have data compromises, who have been hacked, who have their firmware been compromised. Nobody wants to be that name that is being covered by Reuters or the next post online. So how we do that is really starting at that root, designing the proper PKI, owning that PKI, knowing where the source comes from, and we have to do this constantly. Secondly, is protecting your production against that counterfeit. And we do this again by starting from issuance of from your own PKI, those unique birth identities that live in those devices, as Guillaume mentioned. And that's something that, again, you can do once at the beginning. It's used for that purpose, but the most important part is knowing what route it comes from and that you have control of that route, ideally in an offline situation, so it's not accessed only when it needs to be, but that's why we have the issuing CAs. That's how we design PKI. But again, have that unique initial birth identity. Thirdly is understanding your production outsourcing policy. And again, while you're likely using other partners for manufacturing, to be able to keep a strict control around the process of how the birth certificates are actually injected. So there's multiple ways to do that. There's certain hardware appliances. There's methods you can do to do a sort of an initial certificate and then swap out the certificate once at a later date or when the device is actually commissioned. So, but that again is something that we can work on, or we do work on with our clients. Another one which we were touching on earlier is really optimization of SKUs. And so how to be able to make the right number of parts with the right configurations and be able to do customization or future software updates to those pieces of hardware to be able to differentiate. And that allows you to have efficiency within your production, to run a lean operation. If you have this capability to securely be able to differentiate and update using the trusted credential of each device. When it comes to firmware upgrades, again, this is very important. We talk about the proper code signing process, whether that's from initial signature of firmware as it's flashed into initial product, and then also that firmware signature is verified before any firmware OTA is received, installed, and booted up. So that's something that we're seeing, especially in customers that have that sell to the governments, federal, right? So there's secure boot processes that are it's very important to make sure that you're trusting these different stages of your firmware before just allowing new code to start running. So very, very important to think about that. That's why we say frequently. This isn't something that you just do once. That is something that you should be verifying very often. Again, when it comes to defective devices, this kind of ties a little bit into the counterfeiting as well, but making sure that if you do have a device that comes back to your facility, to your operations, maintenance, that it really is something that you've produced, that it isn't some sort of counterfeit hardware that's gotten out there that then you're going to inherently trust because it has a stamp from your company on that. This is something that's very important because, again, it impacts your business, your bottom line, your operational dollars that are very important. So again, hacking, how do we prevent that? It's basically everything that we've kind of been talking about. It's starting from that initial unique identity, knowing that root of trust, signing the firmware, implementing secure boot if you so desire, and having a way to update those credentials. So picking a duration of renewal that is sufficient for your business, that works for your business, short-lived certificates that can be validated, updated, that will keep you the most protected throughout the life of the devices. So to wrap it up here, I think we've got a bit more conversation to talk about how we can do this, and I think we've implemented in a you know, what works, but what's really ultimately the best if you had like the ideal situation. So Guillaume's going to talk us through some of the concepts here.
Okay, thank you, Hélène. What's interesting when we start talking certificates with customers, you know, certificates are used in secure connectivity. So most famous protocol is TLS. So when you HTTP with a server, you have that S, that means that you have a TLS connection. So best case, mutual authentication between the device and the server, and then establishment of a secure channel. And in order to do that, you need a certificate. And we have customers, or we have knowledge of customers coming to us that have some capability to implement those secure connections and those mechanisms we've discussed. And they understand that they have something that works, but they're not entirely sure that it's done the best way. And it starts, I think, with the self-signed certificate. So Andreas, I think you also have a great experience of the self-signed certificate in the industry. So a self-signed certificate is basically the equivalent would be, well, I need a passport or an identity card to go to the grocery store, but I don't want to buy the real official government passport, and maybe the grocery store is okay for me to print my own passport and sign it, and that works. Okay, so that's how the self-signed certificate is in the industry. So basically, a self-signed certificate is a certificate that will be cryptographically valid and will be capable of establishing a secure link with some distant device, but there's no trust in it, because the only trust that there's in it is in the signature. And if you sign the thing yourself, that the other end has to trust that signature without even knowing who's behind and how it's being handled, it won't work. So basically, we've listed a few cases here. So can you control your production, like Hélène was discussing about, when you're manufacturing devices overseas and you have to control your production? Can you do that with a non-trusted contract manufacturing and with self-signed certificates? The answer is no, because in the self-signed certificate, it will be your machine itself that will sign its certificate. So your contract manufacturer will be capable of duplicating your production, and the counterfeit devices would have the same kind of certificate signed by themselves, and you would have no way to differentiate. So you could not discriminate between genuine and counterfeit devices. Of course, you would not be able to check the genuineness of the device when they try to connect to another device or to an application server, because you can establish a secure channel, but the signature has no validity. And if you want to recover from a security disaster, well, here it does not apply, because you don't have an issuing certificate authority. Your certificates are self-signed, so there's not even a way to monitor anything or to recover from anything. So the self-signed certificate is good to, maybe Andreas, we can say that, to try things out in product development. That can be a good way to develop your software and to check, an easy way to check your software on the functionality that everything works. But as soon as you're turning into real production, run away from that. Another breed of certificates are certificates that can be provided to you by silicon vendors, which offer the capability to sell you secure elements, for instance, or MCUs with a digital identity already inside the chip. And that's very, very convenient. But you have to know that those identities all come from the same root, which is not your root, which is the root of that silicon vendor. And that means that root is shared among all their customers, and that probably includes your competitors. So controlling your production using that kind of certificate becomes, again, difficult, because your contract manufacturer, you are being assigned a unique part number with that silicon vendor to get those certificates and those silicon into your production. And that contract manufacturer can order in your name from your silicon vendor. So if they decide to order 10% more and pay the bill different way, and if you don't have very strict control in place with your silicon vendor, there might be a problem here. How can you discriminate between your devices and counterfeit devices? Again, it's very difficult, because the signature all comes from the same root, and you don't control that root. So the only way you would have to do that would be to maintain a very precise database with what you manufactured and what you approved, and that at every connection, you scan that database, which can be quite huge depending on the business you're in. And it might not be very convenient to do that, and time consuming, energy consuming, and it's costly, right? If you subscribe to database services with cloud partners, well, you get an invoice which is proportional to the size of the database. So again, implementing security is doable, but implementing full security is very, very cost ineffective. Again, if you want to recover from a disaster, you don't have many alternatives, because if it is the root of that silicon vendor that gets compromised, well, what can you do? So the best way that we recommend, and it's no surprise considering what we've discussed previously, is that you operate and you own your own PKI and your own root, so that whenever you issue a device, cryptographically, you can check that it ties back to that unique root that you operate and not somebody else's, so that you can very easily control your production. Now, nobody else can issue those certificates without you knowing, because you're in control of the identity which is being issued. So if you order 10,000, it's not 10,001. It's strictly 10,000. And then checking a device is easy because you can chain the certificate all back to the root and you control everything. So you're in control when you open a communication channel to another device. You're in control when you open a communication channel to a server. And you can implement very easily mutual authentication there. And again, if you want to recover from a disaster, again, what could be compromised then is your certificate chain, because maybe the implementation was not optimal, or maybe your company's been hacked or whatever. Again, you have a way out, because then again, you're in control of the root, so you can derive another root from another tree and move your production, move your live assets. If you have implemented that possibility into the firmware, can move them overnight to a different operational PKI tree. And again, you're in full control. And that makes a real difference in terms of security.
Wonderful. Thank you, Guillaume. That was definitely a lot of great tips. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here, bring it back to Andreas and see, do we have any additional questions, comments? I know we're getting close to the end of time today.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm looking also on the time. We have 4 minutes left. Yeah, so there comes one question talking about the manufacturer embedded certificate that is not a renewal certificate, as we know. And we are trying to put an 802.1 certificate on the IoT device. So we have to do, they need an automated request. And today all is manual. That is what they stated. And I can agree with this statement. That today, especially on this level, all is manual today.
Yes, but you have ways to automate things.
Absolute.
Yes, you have ways to automate things. So when you're manufacturing a specific product, you can implement in your factory or inside the product software mechanisms to talk to a PKI, the PKI which is issuing those digital identities, and to completely automate the process. And there are ways for you to host the PKI either in the factory or somewhere else, and still to maintain a very good security, a very strong security. You have the possibility to outsource the manufacturing to somebody else in a different country. That somebody else can tap into your identities either offline or in real time, depending on the quality of the connection, depending on the contract you have with them. So you can manufacture in batches or one by one. It's all doable. That's the good news.
That brings me to a point that I see more and more, is that we have so many degrees of freedom in this technology around issuing certificate, that sometimes, from my point of view, somebody who is not so deeply into this, it is very confusing. So, and also to prevent product designers, especially in the IoT space, from making mistakes. Do we need more standards? Do we need more best practices or whatever?
Yes, there are best practices, there are standards. So depending on the vertical you're manufacturing in, there are standards that exemplify what a certificate should be. So the latest example is the Matter standard for the smart home. So they give a very, very precise description of what the PKI should be for the OEM, for the operations, and the exact format of the certificate. And then you have standards like the latest ETSI standard for consumer devices. And they give you guidelines. And of course, there are professionals that are here to help. In the automobile industry, they also have standards that explain precisely what should be done. In the industry 4.0 again. So it's I think that 10 years ago, yes, it was more difficult because everyone was trying to understand what should be done. But now in 2022, I think that we have leading standards in some verticals, and they're showing the way even to those industries who don't have them yet.
Okay, perfect. So that brings us to a very good end. I want to say thank you to Alan and also to you, Guillaume. And so we will continue this series of webinars also in the next year. And we are preparing, I hope, a nice program over the next weeks. And then it will be published beginning of January. So many thanks for today. And thank you to Alan. Thank you to Guillaume. And
Thank you.
All right.
Happy holidays.
see you in the next year.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.